Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone. When I was a kid, my brother and I used to get up in the middle of the night to look for snacks. It was one of those little things that felt exciting when you were young. The house would be quiet, everyone else would be asleep, and we would whisper to each other upstairs about whether there was anything good left in the cupboards. Sometimes we would find cookies, sometimes cereal, sometimes chips, fruit, leftover food, or whatever we could get without making too much noise. We were never supposed to be up that late. That was part of what made it fun. Our bedrooms were upstairs and the kitchen was downstairs. The fridge and the cupboards were on the lower floor, so getting a snack meant walking through the dark house while trying not to wake our parents. The house had 2 stories, and at night it always felt larger than it did during the day. In daylight, the stairs were just stairs. The hallway was just a hallway. The kitchen was bright, busy, and familiar. There were always normal sounds in the house during the day. The television might be on, someone might be talking, doors would open and close. You could hear footsteps, water running, cupboards shutting, or music playing from another room. But after midnight, everything changed. The upstairs landing felt darker, the stairs creaked louder, the shadows in the corners seemed deeper. Even familiar rooms felt different once the lights were off and everyone was asleep. My brother and I would sometimes go together, especially if we were both awake. We would sneak down the stairs as quietly as possible, stepping around the places we knew creaked. Then we would head toward the kitchen and try to get something without making noise. Other times, one of us would go alone. That night, I went by myself. I do not remember why my brother did not come with me. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he had not wanted anything. Maybe I was just hungry enough that I did not bother waking him up. Whatever the reason, I remember slipping out of my room and making my way downstairs as quietly as I could. The whole house was dark. I could see just enough to get around. There was probably a little light coming from a window somewhere, or maybe the faint glow from an outside streetlight. But most of the rooms were black shapes and familiar outlines. I knew the layout well enough that I did not need to turn on lights. That was the point. If I turned on a light, someone might wake up and ask what I was doing. So I moved slowly, careful not to hit anything, careful not to make the stairs creak too loudly, careful not to let a door close behind me. When I got downstairs, I headed toward the fridge. The fridge was in a hallway that sat directly in front of my parents' bedroom. That was always the risky part. You had to walk past their door, and if they were light sleepers, even the sound of the fridge opening might be enough to wake them. Still, I had done it before. I knew how to be quiet. I moved into the hallway, keeping my eyes on the dark outline of the fridge. The rest of the kitchen was mostly hidden in shadow. The hallway connected to the kitchen, and the kitchen led into a back room farther behind it. At night, that whole part of the house felt like one long, dark passage. I opened the fridge door slowly. The light inside came on immediately. It was bright enough to make me squint. For a second, it felt comforting. The inside of the fridge looked normal. Shelves, bottles, leftovers, containers, maybe some fruit, maybe something wrapped in foil. It was an ordinary sight. Safe, familiar, I started looking for something to eat. Then I heard a sound coming from my parents' bedroom. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises. Floors shift, pipes click, doors move slightly in their frames. If you are awake in the middle of the night, you notice every little sound because there is nothing else to cover it up. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. They sounded like someone getting out of bed. I froze. My first thought was that one of my parents had woken up and heard me in the kitchen. I imagined them opening the bedroom door and catching me standing in front of the fridge. I was not scared of getting in serious trouble, but I did not want to be caught. I did not want the lights turned on. I did not want to explain why I was downstairs. I did not want anyone asking why I had not just waited until morning. So I quickly started to close the fridge. That was when the footsteps changed. They got louder, faster. The sound moved toward me. At first, I still thought it was one of my parents walking quickly into the hallway. Maybe my mother had gotten up to see what I was doing. Maybe she had heard the fridge door open and thought someone had broken in. Maybe she was just going into the kitchen for something too. But the footsteps did not sound normal. They were too fast, too uneven. They came down the hallway with a strange rhythm, as though whoever was moving was not walking the way a person should walk. My hand was still on the fridge door. The cold light from inside the fridge spilled into the dark hallway behind me. I could see a patch of floor in the reflection of the light. I could see part of the wall. I could see just enough of the hallway to know there was movement behind me. I turned around, and I saw my mother. At least, I thought it was my mother. She was moving past me down the hallway in a position that made no sense. She was bent backward in what looked like a backwards spider pose. Her hands and feet were on the floor, but her body was arched unnaturally. Her back was curved in a way I had never seen a person move before. Her head was tilted back, and she moved quickly, almost like she was crawling, but facing the wrong direction. She passed me in the narrow light from the fridge. For a second, I could see her body clearly enough to know it was her shape, her size, her clothes, or at least something that looked exactly like her. But she was not moving like my mother. My mother was not athletic. She was not someone who could twist herself into strange positions, do acrobatic movements, or move across the floor with her body bent backward like that. I had never seen her do anything even close to it. It did not look possible. I did not have time to think. I did not have time to ask her what she was doing. I did not have time to wonder whether she was sleepwalking or whether I was somehow seeing something wrong in the dark. The second I saw her pass by in that position, I started crying. Then I ran. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could. I did not care whether the stairs creaked. I did not care whether I woke my parents. I did not care about the snack anymore. I did not care that the fridge door might still be open. I just wanted to get away from the hallway. I remember rushing upstairs, my heart beating so hard that it hurt. I remember getting into my bedroom and jumping into bed as if the blankets could protect me from whatever I had just seen. I pulled the covers over myself. I probably stayed completely still, listening. That is one of the worst parts of being scared as a kid. You do not just run away from what frightened you. You bring it with you. You lie in bed afterward, hearing every small sound in the house and wondering if it is coming closer. I could hear the house settling. I could hear pipes. Maybe I could hear the refrigerator motor from downstairs. Every sound made me think of footsteps. Every creak made me imagine something moving through the hallway. I did not know if my mother had gone into the back room. I did not know if she had gone back into her bedroom. I did not know whether she even knew I had seen her. I only knew that I had watched something that looked like my mother move in a way that did not seem human. I do not remember sleeping much that night. Maybe I eventually fell asleep out of exhaustion. Kids can be terrified and still fall asleep because there is nothing else they can do. Maybe I kept the blankets over my head until morning. Maybe I waited until daylight came through the window before I felt safe enough to move. But I remember waking up the next day with the memory still sharp in my mind. It had not faded the way dreams fade. It did not feel like one of those strange nightmares where you wake up and quickly realize the room looks normal again. I remembered the fridge light. I remembered the hallway. I remembered the sound of the footsteps speeding up. And I remembered my mother passing me in that horrible backward position. I could still picture it. That morning, I told my mom. I probably did not explain it perfectly. I was a kid, and I did not have the words for it. I may have just blurted out that I saw her crawling weirdly in the hallway. I may have told her she scared me. I may have asked why she had been walking like that. But I remember telling her about it. She had no memory of it. She did not remember getting up. She did not remember going into the hallway. She did not remember going into the kitchen or back room. She told me maybe it had been a bad dream. That was the easiest explanation. Maybe I had been half asleep when I went downstairs. Maybe I had dreamed part of it while standing at the fridge. Maybe the fridge light, the darkness, and the sound of someone moving in their room had mixed together in my mind. Maybe I had seen a shadow in the hallway, and my brain turned it into my mother. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. That is possible. But it did not feel like a dream. The house had felt real. The fridge had felt real. The cold air from inside the fridge had touched my face. The light had shone onto the hallway floor behind me, and the footsteps had gotten louder and faster before I turned around. I had never been so scared in my life. Even after my mom told me it was probably a dream, I could not fully accept that answer. I kept thinking about how specific it was. I had not seen some vague monster in a nightmare. I had seen my own mother. I had recognized her right away. That was what made it so upsetting. If it had been a shadow, a stranger, or an animal, it would have been frightening. But seeing your mother look wrong is different. Your parents are supposed to be familiar. They are supposed to be safe. You know the way they walk. You know the way they talk. You know the sound of their footsteps in the house. You know what they look like when they are tired, when they are angry, when they are laughing, and when they are half asleep. But I had seen my mother moving in a way that did not belong to her. That image stayed with me. For years afterward, I did not like going downstairs alone at night. I would avoid the kitchen if I could. I would wait until morning for snacks. If I had to go downstairs for water or anything else, I would turn on lights. I did not want to walk through that hallway in the dark again. I especially did not want to open the fridge and stand with my back to my parents' bedroom. The refrigerator light became part of the fear. Any time I opened a fridge in a dark kitchen, I remembered that night. The bright white light spilling out into a dark room. The feeling of being exposed. The way the shadows behind me seemed larger because I was standing in front of the only source of light. I started being more aware of where doors were. I became more aware of what was behind me. I would sometimes close the fridge quickly instead of standing there deciding what to eat. I would glance behind me before reaching for anything. Even though I knew it was irrational, part of me expected to see that shape again. I never did. Not exactly. I never saw my mother crawl through the hallway like that again. I never heard those same footsteps racing toward me again. Nothing else happened that was so clear or so terrifying. But the memory did not go away. There are some things you see as a kid that become fixed in your mind. You can grow older, become more logical, understand more about sleep, dreams, shadows, and fear, but the original image stays exactly where it was. That was one of those things for me. As I got older, I thought about other explanations. Maybe my mother really had been sleepwalking. Some people can get up at night and do strange things without remembering them in the morning. They can walk, talk, open doors, go to other rooms, and later have no memory of it. Maybe she was in some kind of half-awake state. Maybe I saw her moving in a strange way that my childhood fear exaggerated. Maybe she had simply bent down to pick something up, and the low light made her body look completely different. Maybe I caught a glimpse of her turning into the back room, and my mind filled in the rest. Maybe the fridge door light threw shadows that made a normal movement look unnatural. Maybe I was dreaming while awake. There are moments between sleep and waking where people can see or hear things that feel completely real. The brain can blend a dream with the actual room around you. You can be awake enough to walk, hear sounds, and see your surroundings, but still not fully aware. That would explain why my mother had no memory of it. It would explain why I was the only person who experienced it. It would explain why the event felt so impossible. But even with all those explanations, I still cannot forget the way it looked. The backward arch of her body, the speed of the footsteps, the way she moved past me without saying anything. The hallway connecting to the kitchen and then to the back room. I remember thinking she must have gone into the back room, because I did not see where else she could have gone. But I never checked. I was too scared. I did not look down the hallway afterward. I did not go into the kitchen. I did not follow her. I ran upstairs and hid in bed. That is the part I sometimes think about most. What would have happened if I had stayed? What would I have seen if I had followed the sound into the back room? Would my mother have been there normally, standing up and confused? Would the hallway have been empty? Would I have seen nothing at all? I do not know. And I am glad I do not know. Some memories are scary because of what happened. Others are scary because of what you did not see. I did not see where she went. I did not see her return to her room. I did not see her wake up. I only saw her pass me in that impossible position. Then I ran. The next morning, everything was normal. My mom was normal. The house was normal. The kitchen was normal. The fridge was normal. There was no sign that anything had happened. No strange mess in the hallway. No broken objects. No furniture moved. No explanation that made the night feel less disturbing. Just my memory. To this day, it is still the scariest thing I have ever witnessed. I have seen scary movies. I have heard ghost stories. I have had nightmares. I have been in dark places and felt uneasy. But nothing has ever stayed with me the way that moment did. Because when you see your own mother looking like that, you do not forget it. You cannot easily convince yourself it was nothing. You can tell yourself it was a dream. You can tell yourself you were tired. You can tell yourself the fridge light and the darkness played tricks on your eyes. You can tell yourself she might have been sleepwalking. But the image remains. The sound of footsteps getting louder, the bright refrigerator light behind you, the dark hallway, and your mother moving past you in a way that your mind still cannot make sense of. That is something that stays with you, forever etched into your brain. About 12 years ago, my ex, Lisa, had a best friend named Karen, who she had known since middle school. We all lived in a small town in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, the kind of place where almost every building had some age to it. Even the nicer apartments and renovated houses still had that older town feeling underneath. You could repaint the walls, replace a few fixtures, put in newer carpet, and call it updated. But there was usually still something worn beneath the surface. People called it the landlord special. Fresh paint over old problems, new cabinet handles on crooked doors, a cheap light fixture covering an older ceiling stain. That kind of thing. Karen and her boyfriend at the time, Anders, had moved into an upstairs duplex apartment. From the outside, the building looked decent enough. It was detached, not part of a big apartment complex, and there was nobody living below them. It was just one older building that had been split into separate living spaces at some point. The place looked pretty nice on the surface. It was not fancy, but it had enough room for the two of them. There was a living room, a kitchen, a hallway, a bedroom, and an attic access door near the upper part of the apartment. Everything had been painted recently. The floors looked clean, the walls were a neutral color. It had the usual signs of somebody trying to make an old place look fresh. Karen and Anders had only been there for about 2 weeks when Lisa and I came over. It was supposed to be a normal visit. We were there to see the apartment, hang out, maybe have a few drinks, talk about their move, and hear all the usual stories people tell after settling into a new place. You know the type of conversation, what they liked about it, what was annoying already, which room was colder than the others, what needed fixing, whether the landlord seemed decent. Karen gave us a tour almost immediately. She was excited about the place. Even though it was older, it had character. That was how she described it. The kitchen was small but usable. The living room had good light during the day. Their bedroom was bigger than the one they had before. The upstairs location gave them more privacy. And then, somewhere during the tour, the conversation turned to the attic. Lisa and Karen both loved that stuff. Ghost hunting shows, ancient aliens, haunted hotels, random paranormal documentaries where a man walks through a dark basement holding a camera and suddenly says he heard a voice. They loved it all, not in a deadly serious way, at least not most of the time. They enjoyed it. They treated it like entertainment. They would watch ghost hunting shows together and argue about whether a blurry shape in the corner was actually something or just bad video quality. So when Karen began talking about the weird things in the apartment, Lisa was immediately interested. "What kind of weird things?" she asked. Karen gave this half-laugh, half-nervous smile. "Mostly attic stuff," she said. Anders was standing nearby when she said it. He did not laugh. That was the first thing I noticed. Karen might have been playing up the spooky side of it because she enjoyed that kind of thing, but Anders looked uncomfortable. He was quiet, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, like he had already heard the stories too many times and did not want to make them sound more real by talking about them. I asked what had been happening. Karen told us they would hear footsteps upstairs at night. At first, I assumed she meant on the roof. That would be normal in an older building. Branches scrape against shingles. Animals move around. Rain sounds strange. A house settles. Squirrels or raccoons can make an unbelievable amount of noise if they get into an attic or crawl space. But she said it did not sound like that. She said it sounded like someone walking, slowly, back and forth. Not every night, but often enough that they had started paying attention. They would be in bed or sitting in the living room, and suddenly there would be a few footsteps directly above them. A creak, a pause, another creak, then nothing. Sometimes it would happen near the attic door in the hallway. Other times it sounded farther away, as though someone was walking across the space above their bedroom. Karen said they had checked for animals. They had asked the landlord about insulation, old pipes, roof access, and whether there was another unit connected somewhere they did not know about. As far as they were told, there was no one else living above them. No maintenance person was coming in at night. No hidden second staircase. No upstairs neighbor. Just the attic. Then there was the music. That was the part that got Lisa's attention. Karen said that sometimes, in the middle of the night, They would hear what sounded like country music coming from above them. Not loud, clear music. Not like someone had a radio on. It was faint and distorted, like an old song being played too slowly through a damaged speaker. Karen said it sounded like a country song about friendship or being friends, but neither she nor Anders could remember the actual lyrics. It would only happen for a short time, sometimes a few seconds, sometimes long enough that they could sit up in bed and listen to it. Then it would stop. I remember laughing a little when she told us that. Not because I was trying to be rude, I just did not believe in ghosts, demons, haunted attics, or anything like that. At the time, I was a complete skeptic. I thought people's brains were extremely good at filling in gaps. A house makes a weird sound, and suddenly it becomes footsteps. A distant car radio, television, or neighbor's music carries through a wall, and suddenly it becomes a ghost singing upstairs. That was how I saw it. The mind plays tricks. Memory changes. Fear turns vague sounds into stories. I told them there was probably some normal explanation. Maybe a radio signal was coming through an old electrical system. Maybe sound was traveling from another house in a weird way. Maybe an animal was moving around in the attic. Maybe the roof structure was shifting at night because temperatures dropped. They listened, but neither of them looked convinced. Then Karen pointed out the attic door. It was in the hallway, close to the bedroom. At first glance, it was ordinary. A narrow door painted the same color as the walls. It had a deadbolt lock on it. It looked like the kind of attic entrance you would find in an old apartment where the landlord had probably stored insulation, wiring, pipes, or random junk. Karen said it was always open in the morning. Every single morning. That was what bothered her most. She and Anders would lock it before bed. Not just close it. Lock it. They would check the deadbolt. They would pull on the door to make sure it was secure. Then, when they woke up, the door would be open. Not thrown wide open. Not hanging off its hinges. Just slightly open. A few inches. Enough that it would sway gently in the hallway when air moved through the apartment. Karen said she had tried everything. She had checked whether the lock was loose. She had tested the door during the day. She had made Anders lock it while she watched. He had made her lock it while he watched. They had both checked it before bed. And still, every morning, it was open. I walked over and looked at it myself. The deadbolt seemed real enough. The door seemed ordinary. I pulled on it. I checked the frame. There was nothing obviously broken. Nothing that made me think it could simply swing open on its own. Still, I assumed there had to be an explanation. Maybe the bolt did not go deep enough into the frame. Maybe the door warped with temperature changes. Maybe the building shifted slightly at night. Maybe they were forgetting to lock it properly. I did not say that last part out loud because I could tell they were both getting defensive about it. But that was what I thought. I remember leaving that night not feeling afraid at all. I thought the apartment was old. I thought Karen and Lisa had fed off each other's interest in ghost stories. I thought Anders was probably tired and annoyed because he was living in an older place with strange noises and a girlfriend who watched too many paranormal shows. That was it. Then, 2 days later, I woke up to Lisa frantically texting Karen. It was still dark outside. I do not know the exact time, but it was early enough that I assumed something had gone wrong with a family member or that Karen needed help with something serious. Lisa was sitting upright in bed, phone in both hands, typing fast. She looked pale. Not tired pale. Not I just woke up pale, actually shaken. I asked what was wrong. At first, she did not answer. She kept reading messages, then typing, then staring at the screen like she did not know what to say. Finally, she told me Karen and Anders were packing up their apartment and leaving immediately. I thought maybe there had been a break-in. Maybe a pipe had burst. Maybe something had happened with the landlord. But Lisa said, Karen saw something in the bedroom. That was when I stopped dismissing it quite so easily. According to Karen, she woke up sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. She had been asleep beside Anders. The room was dark, except for whatever faint light came through the window. Maybe street light, maybe moonlight, maybe nothing more than the kind of dim gray darkness your eyes slowly adjust to when you wake in the middle of the night. At first she thought she had heard something in the hallway. Then she opened her eyes. There was a figure standing in the bedroom doorway. She described it as tall, humanoid, but not clearly human. It looked like it was wearing some kind of robe, though she could not make out the details. The figure was darker than the room around it, not completely black, but black enough that she could not see clothing, skin, or any real features, except the eyes. She said it had 2 deep, dark eyes, not glowing, not bright, just dark, hollow-looking places in its face. It stood in the doorway for a moment. Karen thought she was dreaming. Then it moved. It came into the room slowly, not rushing, not making a sound, just moving closer. She said it held one hand out toward her. The fingers looked too long. The fingernails looked long too, almost black against the darkness. At that point, she knew she was awake. At least, that was what she insisted later. She said it was not sleep paralysis because she could move. She was terrified, but she could move. She pulled the blanket over her head and reached for Anders beside her. She tried to hold on to him. She tried to wake him. She tried to hide under the covers like a child, even though she was an adult, and knew how ridiculous it sounded. Then something grabbed the blanket and pulled it away. Karen said the covers were ripped off her hard enough that she felt the cold air hit her skin. She said she felt an icy touch move down the length of her back, from the top of her shoulder down toward her lower back. She started screaming. Anders woke up confused, trying to understand what was happening. By the time he was fully awake, the figure was gone. The bedroom door was open. The hallway outside was empty. The attic door was open too. That was the part Karen kept repeating. It was open. She said she and Anders had locked it before bed. I heard all of this through Lisa's texts and her retelling of what Karen was saying in real time. At first, I still had doubts. People can wake from nightmares and feel completely convinced something happened. People can have sleep paralysis, vivid dreams, panic attacks, and sensory experiences that feel physically real. Scratches can come from bedding, pets, skin irritation, or accidentally dragging nails across yourself in sleep. I knew all of that. I still know all of that. But then Lisa showed me the picture. Karen had gotten out of bed in the morning and noticed that her back hurt. At first, she thought she had pulled something or slept wrong. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw scratches. 3 long red marks running down her back. They were not tiny marks. They were not a few faint lines that could have come from dry skin or a zipper. They were big, solid red scratches, maybe about 1 foot long. About 2 inches apart from each other, they looked raw and fresh. I saw the picture, and I swear they were real. I am not saying I know what caused them. I am not saying they could only have come from something supernatural. But they were not imaginary. They were there. The photo was not blurry. It was not a bad angle. You could see the marks clearly. 3 long red lines across her back, deep enough that they looked painful. That was the moment I stopped laughing about the attic. Karen and Anders were out of the apartment by noon that day. They did not wait for the landlord. They did not go back that night. They packed what they could, grabbed the essentials, and left. I do not know whether they ever returned for the rest of their things. Maybe they had someone else help them. Maybe they arranged it with the landlord later. Maybe they had friends go with them during daylight, but they refused to sleep there again. I remember thinking about how different their reactions were compared with just a few days earlier. When we visited, Karen and Lisa had been laughing about ghost shows. They were excited about the strange stories. It was fun to them. Spooky noises, a weird attic door, faint music at night. Those were the kinds of things they liked to talk about. But after that night, Karen was not laughing. Anders was not brushing it off. They were scared enough to leave a home they had just moved into. That mattered to me. I had known Karen long enough to understand that she liked creepy stories. I knew she could be dramatic sometimes, especially when she and Lisa got into paranormal stuff. But I also knew the difference between someone enjoying a spooky idea and someone genuinely terrified. She was genuinely terrified. For a while afterward, I kept trying to make sense of it. I thought about the attic door. Maybe it really had a faulty lock. Maybe changes in temperature or humidity caused the frame to shift at night. Old wooden doors can move. Old buildings settle. A deadbolt can look secure but not engage properly. I thought about the footsteps. Maybe there were animals in the attic. Raccoons can sound like people. Squirrels can make noises that seem impossibly loud when they are directly above a ceiling. Even pipes and heating systems can create sounds that resemble walking. I thought about the music. Maybe it came from a nearby house. Maybe an old radio signal bled through a wire. Maybe someone outside played music late at night and the sound traveled strangely through the roof. I thought about the scratches. Maybe Karen had done it herself without realizing. Maybe she had scratched her back while pulling the covers up. Maybe Anders had moved in his sleep. Maybe something sharp in the bedding had caused it. There were possibilities, but none of them explained everything in a way that felt satisfying. The biggest problem was the timing. The apartment had strange things happening almost immediately after they moved in. The attic door opened every morning. They heard footsteps and music. Then, Karen woke up to a figure in the doorway, felt something touch her, and discovered 3 long marks down her back. Maybe every piece had a separate explanation. Maybe the door was defective. Maybe the music came from outside. Maybe the footsteps came from animals. Maybe the figure was a nightmare. Maybe the scratches had a physical cause. That was still possible. But when you put all of it together, in that old upstairs apartment with nobody living below them and no one else in the building, it became hard to see it as nothing. At least for me. I did not become a full believer overnight. I did not suddenly decide every creaking floorboard meant a ghost was nearby. I did not start watching ghost hunting shows or looking for demons in old houses. But I stopped being quite so certain that every story had an easy answer. Before that apartment, I thought people who believed in ghosts were simply misreading ordinary things. Afterward, I still thought most strange experiences probably had normal explanations. But I also understood why people could be shaken by something they could not explain. There are experiences that do not fit neatly into one category. You can call it a nightmare, but then there are scratches. You can call it a mechanical problem, but then there is the door opening night after night. You can call it an animal, but then there is the music. You can call it coincidence, but then there is the timing of everything happening in the same small space. I never saw anything in that apartment myself. That is important. I did not hear the country music. I did not see the attic door open on its own. I did not hear footsteps from above. I did not see the tall figure in the bedroom doorway. All I saw was the photo, 3 red scratches on Karen's back. And I saw the way Lisa reacted while reading Karen's messages that morning. The fear was real. Whatever happened, the fear was real. Anders and Karen leaving that apartment by noon was real too. I never heard of anything equally convincing after that. I have heard plenty of ghost stories since, I have seen plenty of videos that are probably fake. I have listened to people explain noises, shadows, dreams, and strange feelings in old buildings. Most of the time, I still lean toward a normal explanation. I still believe the mind can be convincing. I still believe people can misremember things, especially when they are scared or exhausted. But that apartment changed something in me. It made me realize that skepticism does not always mean laughing at people. Sometimes someone tells you a story that sounds impossible, and you do not know what to say because they are not trying to entertain you. They are afraid. To this day, I do not know what Karen saw that night. I do not know what touched her. I do not know why the attic door opened every morning. I do not know whether something was really walking above them, or whether the faint country music had a mundane source that nobody ever found. And I do not know what caused those scratches. But I remember the photo. I remember Lisa's face. I remember realizing that the friends who had been laughing about ghost hunting shows only 2 days earlier were suddenly packing their belongings and refusing to go back. And that was enough to make me rethink my entire mindset about spirits, demons, and all the things I had always assumed people were imagining. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my second oldest brother and I shared a bedroom. I do not remember every detail of the room now, but I remember enough of it to know how familiar it was to me. It was where we slept every night. We knew the sounds the house made. We knew how the floor creaked outside the bedroom. We knew when our father was walking through the hallway, when someone was in the kitchen, and when the washing machine or pipes made their usual noises. At night, though, the room always felt different. During the day, it was just a shared bedroom. There were clothes, toys, blankets, maybe posters or things on shelves, and the usual mess that comes with kids sharing a space. But after the lights went out, the room became a collection of shapes. The furniture seemed farther away. The corners became darker. Every small sound from the house sounded bigger because there was nothing else happening. My brother and I had separate beds. I do not remember whether they were directly across from each other or against opposite walls, but I remember his bed being close enough that I could climb into it when I was scared. He was older than me, and to a little kid, that made him seem like someone who knew what to do. He was not an adult, of course. He was still a child himself. But when you are 5 or 6, an older brother can feel like the safest person in the world. That night, we had already gone to bed. The room was dark, and the house had become quiet. I remember being awake, though I cannot say whether I had been trying to sleep for a long time or had only just settled down. I remember lying there listening to the ordinary nighttime sounds. Then we heard something outside the bedroom. At first, it was quiet enough that I was not sure what it was. A small noise, maybe a floorboard creaking, maybe footsteps in the hallway, maybe something brushing against the wall. I remember looking toward the bedroom door. My brother heard it too. That was important to me, even then. I was not the only one awake. I was not the only one listening. He had stopped moving as well. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. We just listened. The sound came again. This time it was more clearly like something moving outside the room. Not a loud crash, not a parent calling one of our names, just the sound of someone or something moving close to the door. I got scared immediately. I climbed out of my own bed and went to my brother's. I remember getting under his blankets or sitting on the edge of his mattress beside him. We both faced the bedroom door. We were waiting for one of our parents to open it, or maybe for the sound to stop so we could tell ourselves it had been nothing. But the door opened. Slowly, there was no bright hallway light coming in. The hallway was dark, too. The door moved enough that we could see a shape in the doorway. darker than the darkness around it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. Then I saw its eyes. They were dimly red, not bright like flashlights, not glowing enough to light up the room, but red enough that I could see two small points in the dark. The shape stepped into the room. I still do not know how to describe it without sounding like I am talking about a movie or a nightmare. It was black, not like someone wearing black clothes, more like a figure made out of darkness, with no clear face except those faint red eyes. It seemed too tall or too large for the space, but I was very young, and everything probably looked larger to me then. Still, I remember the feeling that it was not one of my parents. It was not a sibling. It was not a person standing in the hallway. It was something else. Something that had entered our room. My brother reacted before I did. He grabbed a shoe. I do not know where it came from. It might have been on the floor near his bed, or maybe he had kicked it off earlier and it was within reach. But I remember him throwing it toward the figure. It was the kind of thing an older kid would do when they were scared, but trying not to show it. He may have been trying to scare whoever was there. He may have thought it was someone playing a joke. Maybe he thought if he threw something, the shadow would go away. The shoe hit it, or at least hit somewhere near it, and then the thing rushed toward him. Everything happened too fast after that. 1 second, it was by the door. The next second, it was at the bed. I remember it moving quickly, much faster than a person should have been able to move in a dark room. I remember my brother yelling. I remember the shape reaching toward him. Then it bit him on the arm. I heard him scream. I screamed too. It did not feel like a dream while it was happening. It felt immediate and physical. My brother jerked his arm away, and the figure pulled back. I remember a flash of movement, those dim red eyes, and the sound of both of us crying. Then it ran out of the room. I do not remember seeing exactly where it went. It disappeared through the doorway, back into the dark hallway. For a few seconds, my brother and I were just screaming. I was crying so hard that I could barely breathe. My brother was yelling and holding his arm. I remember being terrified that the thing would come back. I remember looking at the open doorway and expecting those red eyes to appear again. Then my father came into the room. He turned on the lights. The brightness hurt my eyes after the darkness. Suddenly, the room looked normal again. The beds were where they always were. The floor was clear. The door was open. There was no black figure in the room. But my brother was still crying, and his arm was hurt. My father asked what was wrong. I remember us trying to explain it at the same time. We were both children, scared and talking quickly. We told him something had come into the room. We told him there had been a black shadow with red eyes. We told him it had bitten my brother. My brother showed him his arm. My father looked at it. I do not remember his exact expression, but I remember the way his mood changed. He did not laugh. He did not simply tell us to go back to sleep. He looked at the mark, then turned and left the room quickly. I remember hearing him moving through the house. He turned on lights, the hallway light, the living room, the kitchen. He checked the front door. He checked the back door. Both were locked. That part has stayed with me because I remember my father calling out. He was shouting, asking who was there. He wanted an answer. He wanted someone to come out, whether it was a person hiding in the house, an intruder, a family member, or anyone who could explain why his son had marks on his arm. But no one answered. The house stayed silent. Then we heard footsteps in the ceiling. That was the part that made the whole night feel impossible. The footsteps were above us, not just a creak from the roof or a random settling sound. They sounded like something moving overhead, across the ceiling space above the bedrooms. My father heard them too. I remember that because he stopped shouting for a moment and looked upward. The house had an attic, but the attic access was in the laundry room. It was not the kind of attic you could casually walk into from a bedroom or hallway. You needed a ladder to reach it. The access panel was inside the laundry closet, and the closet door had been closed. There were no obvious openings from outside, no open windows, no unlocked doors, no staircase leading up to the attic, no way that someone could easily run into the ceiling space and disappear. At least none that we knew about. My father checked. He went to the laundry room. He checked the closet. He looked at the attic panel. Everything was closed. Nothing looked disturbed. But the footsteps had been there. We had all heard them. My father kept calling out, "Who's there?" Nothing. He may have checked the yard too. He may have gone outside and looked around the house. I do not remember every part of what he did because I was still in the bedroom, terrified and crying. But I remember that he took it seriously enough to search. Eventually, he came back to our room. He bandaged my brother's arm. I remember the bandage. I remember the way my brother held his arm close to himself after that. He was scared too, even though he had been the one brave enough to throw the shoe. For a long time afterward, I remembered the bite marks. I remember them looking like teeth scars. Not one small mark, not a scrape from bumping into furniture. They looked like something had bitten into his arm. My brother had the scars for years. That was what made it hard for me to dismiss the memory later. If it had only been me seeing a dark figure in a bedroom, I might have accepted that I had a nightmare. I was young. Children have vivid dreams. Children wake up scared and confuse dreams with real events. But my brother had been there. My father had come into the room. My brother had an injury. And my father had searched the house. Those pieces stayed with me. That was not the only strange thing that happened in that home. There were other moments, other sounds, other things that felt wrong at the time. I do not remember all of them clearly enough to tell them as one story, but I remember the house having a feeling to it. It was not always scary. Most days were normal. We played, ate meals, watched television, fought with siblings, did homework, and lived our lives. But sometimes, especially at night, the house felt different. A hallway would seem too dark. A sound from upstairs would feel too close. A door would creak when nobody was nearby. The ceiling would make noises that did not sound like ordinary settling. Maybe all old houses do that. Maybe once you are scared by one thing, you start noticing every sound afterward. That is possible. But the night with the figure stayed separate in my mind because it felt more real than the others. It was not only a sound. It was not only a shadow. It was something I saw. Something my brother saw. Something my father responded to. And something that left marks on my brother's arm. Years passed. I got older. Eventually, childhood memories became harder to sort through. There are things you remember clearly, and things that become mixed with stories you have heard over and over. Sometimes you remember how something felt more than you remember exactly what happened. Sometimes you are not sure whether you saw something yourself or heard your family talk about it later. But this memory never left me. I could still picture the bedroom door opening. I could still picture the dark shape with dim red eyes. I could still remember my brother throwing the shoe. I could still hear the screaming. And I could still feel the fear of looking at the doorway afterward. Then, when I was around 22 or 23, I was at my father's house with my brother. We were older by then, old enough to talk about childhood without getting embarrassed, old enough to bring up strange family memories and laugh at the things that had scared us when we were little. At some point, I brought up that night. I do not remember how the conversation started. Maybe we were talking about the old house. Maybe someone mentioned nightmares. Maybe I was telling another creepy story and remembered that one. I said something about the black thing in our bedroom. My brother looked at me strangely. He did not remember it. At first, I thought he was joking. I reminded him about the figure, the red eyes, the shoe, the bite on his arm, our father coming in and checking the house, the footsteps in the ceiling. But he still did not remember. He seemed genuinely surprised that I remembered something like that. That was unsettling in a completely different way. I had carried the memory for years. I assumed it belonged to both of us. I assumed that, even if we remembered different details, he would at least remember being bitten, screaming, and our father checking the house. But he did not. He had no memory of it happening. He did not remember the scars either. By then, the scars were gone. The teeth marks I remembered had faded completely over the years. I told my father about the conversation. Or maybe he was already there when I brought it up. I remember asking him whether he remembered that night. I expected him to tell me I had exaggerated it as a kid, or that there had been some normal explanation. But he did remember. He said he could not figure out what had happened that day. That was all he said, but it was enough. He remembered checking the doors. He remembered the attic situation. He remembered that there had been no outside way into the attic that he could find. He remembered that the attic was not something we used. We did not store things up there. Nobody had been up there in a long time. There were no easy access points, no obvious place for someone to hide, and no reason for footsteps to be moving across the ceiling. He could not explain it. Hearing that as an adult made the memory feel heavier. As a child, you can believe anything is possible. Monsters can be real. Shadows can have eyes. A dark figure can come through the door and bite your brother. You are young enough that the world still contains endless unknowns. As an adult, you start looking for explanations. Maybe someone broke into the house. Maybe there was an animal in the attic. Maybe the shadow was a person in the dark, distorted by fear. Maybe my brother was injured by something else. Maybe he scratched himself, got bitten by an insect, or caught his arm on something before bed. Maybe the footsteps were animals or pipes. Maybe my memory changed over time and turned a frightening night into something worse. All of those things are possible, but the details do not fit together cleanly. The doors were locked, the attic access was closed, the house was searched. My father remembered being unable to explain what had happened, and I still remembered the fear too clearly. The strangest part was that my brother did not. He has always been surprised by how much I remember from childhood. I can remember movie clips we watched once. I can remember parts of songs. I can remember family events, small conversations, the layout of rooms, random details from holidays, things other people have forgotten completely. Maybe that is why the memory stayed with me and not him. Maybe I had always held on to things more tightly. Maybe he blocked it out because it was too frightening. Maybe he was too young to form a lasting memory. Maybe he never really saw what I thought we saw, and I filled in his reactions afterward because we were both scared in the room. I do not know. Memory is strange. Two people can experience the same event and remember it differently. One person can remember every detail while another remembers nothing. A child's memory can become vivid in ways that are hard to verify years later. But I cannot shake the fact that my father remembered enough to say he could not explain it. That gives the story a weight it would not have otherwise. If my father had said, "You dreamed that," I might have accepted it more easily. If my brother had said, "Oh yeah, that was just a raccoon in the attic," I might have felt better. If there had been a clear explanation for the bite marks, I might have put the whole thing behind me. But there was not. There was only a dark bedroom, a door opening, a black shape with dim red eyes, a shoe thrown in fear, my brother screaming as something bit his arm, my father searching a house with locked doors, footsteps moving overhead in an attic that should have been inaccessible, And then, years later, the strange realization that the only other child in the room did not remember any of it. Even now, thinking about it gives me goosebumps. It is not because I can say for certain that it was a ghost, a demon, an intruder, or something supernatural. I cannot say that. I do not know what it was. Maybe it was a nightmare built from fear, darkness, and childhood imagination. Maybe it was a real event that our minds never understood properly. Maybe it was something ordinary that became impossible in memory because we were so scared. But when I picture it, I do not picture a dream. I picture my brother's bed. I picture us sitting there, staring at the door. I picture the dim red eyes coming through the darkness, and I remember the feeling that something had entered our room that did not belong there. That feeling has never gone away. Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue. I was driving my coworker home from work one day. We lived fairly close to each other, and after some shifts, I would give him a ride back to his apartment. It had become part of our routine. We would finish work, talk in the car about whatever had happened during the day, complain about customers or management, and then head toward his place. Sometimes we would hang out there afterward. Nothing complicated. We would sit around, relax, watch something, talk about work, and usually smoke weed after the shift was over. It was a normal enough routine for us that I did not think much about it when we got into the car that day. The shift itself had not been unusual. Nothing had happened at work that made me feel stressed or distracted. I was tired in the ordinary way people are after working, but I was awake, alert, and capable of driving. My coworker was talking beside me, and I remember the late afternoon sunlight coming through the windshield. It was not dark yet. The sun was beginning to lower, but there was still plenty of daylight. The streets were visible. The sidewalks were clear. Cars, trees, apartment buildings, traffic lights, and driveways all looked normal. It was not raining. There was no fog. There was no reason that I should have been unable to see something in front of my car. We were getting close to his apartment. His place was only a few blocks away by then, in a suburban part of California with apartment buildings, houses, small landscaped areas, sidewalks, and patches of trees near the edges of the road. It was the kind of neighborhood where you might see people walking dogs, kids on bikes, someone taking out trash, or cars pulling in and out of parking lots. Nothing about it felt remote or isolated. That is part of why what happened still bothers me. I was driving at a normal speed, not fast, not racing through the neighborhood. We were approaching an intersection near his apartment when something suddenly ran out in front of the car. It happened so quickly that I did not have time to identify it. I only caught a glimpse of movement low to the ground. It was small, fast, dark, maybe, but I could not say for sure. One moment the road was clear. The next, something darted out from the side, close enough that I could not avoid it. Then I felt the car roll over it. There was a distinct bump, not a pothole, not a piece of trash, not the normal vibration of a tire passing over uneven pavement. It felt like an animal. The wheel rolled up slightly, then down again. There was a dull, crunching sensation beneath the car. It was quick, but unmistakable enough that my stomach dropped immediately. I slammed on the brakes. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then my coworker asked what happened. I told him I thought I had hit something. My first thought was that it was someone's dog. That idea made me feel sick. In a suburban neighborhood, a small dog getting loose and running into the street was completely possible. Maybe it had slipped out of a yard, maybe it had escaped through a gate, maybe it was chasing something, maybe it was a stray. Whatever it was, I had felt the car go over it. I turned on my hazard lights and pulled over as soon as I could. My coworker and I got out of the car. I was expecting to find something immediately. A dog lying in the road, an injured cat, a dead animal, blood on the pavement. Fur, something. I did not want to find it, but I also needed to know what I had hit. I could not just drive away after feeling that impact and pretend it had not happened. We started looking around the street. The first place we checked was directly behind the car. Then we checked the road in front of it. We looked along the curb, underneath nearby parked cars, and around the small strips of grass near the sidewalk. Nothing. There was no animal in the road. There was no body. There was no injured dog limping away. There was no blood. There was no fur. There was no sign of anything. At first, I thought maybe whatever I hit had somehow survived and run off. That was possible. A small animal can be struck, get scared, and disappear into a yard or brush before you have time to get out of the car. I hoped that was what had happened. It would still be terrible, but at least it would mean I had not killed someone's pet. We looked in the direction the thing had been running. There were some bushes, trees, and spaces between buildings where a small animal could have disappeared. We walked along the edge of the road and scanned the grass. Nothing. We looked under parked cars. Nothing. We listened. No crying, no movement, no scratching or rustling in the brush. My coworker and I started talking through possibilities. Maybe it was a cat. Maybe it was a rabbit. Maybe it was a possum. Maybe it was a small dog that had somehow made it away from the road. But the more we looked, the less any of it made sense. The impact had felt too real. I knew what it felt like to run over something small with a car, not because I had done it before intentionally or often, but because there is a difference between rolling over a bump in the road and feeling something under the tires give way. This had not been a pothole. This had not been a bottle or a piece of wood. Something had moved in front of my car. Something had gone beneath it. And yet, we could find nothing. Then we looked at the car. I expected there to be evidence there. At minimum, I thought there might be fur stuck somewhere near the wheel well. Maybe a smear of dirt, blood, or some mark along the underside. A small car does not have much clearance. If I truly ran over an animal, especially at the angle I thought I did, I expected to see something. But the car looked normal. There was no damage, no dent, no scratch, no blood, no fur, no sign that the underside had hit anything. We crouched down and checked as best we could without lying in the road. We looked near the tires and under the front bumper. Everything seemed normal. That was when the uneasiness started to settle in. Before that, I had been worried about an animal. After that, I was confused. My coworker was confused too. We had both seen something run out in front of the car, though neither of us had gotten a clear look at it. We had both felt the bump. We had both gotten out and searched. So I was not alone in thinking something had happened. We stayed there for a few more minutes. Maybe we hoped the animal would come out from behind a car. Maybe we thought we would find something if we searched farther down the road. But it was late afternoon, and we were standing near traffic with our hazards on. We could not keep searching forever. Eventually, we told ourselves we had done what we could. We had stopped. We had looked. We had tried to find whatever it was. There was nothing more we could do. We got back into the car. My coworker's apartment was only about half a block farther up the road. The drive should have taken less than a minute, and it did. But neither of us was talking much anymore. The mood had changed. Earlier, we had been planning to hang out. We had been looking forward to relaxing after work. But after what happened, neither of us felt like doing that. The idea of smoking weed suddenly felt wrong. I did not want to be high while wondering whether I had run over an animal and somehow lost it. My coworker did not seem interested either. We were both unsettled, and neither of us wanted to make ourselves more anxious or confused. So when I pulled up near his apartment, we skipped our usual plan. He got out. We said goodbye. He probably told me to drive safe. I probably told him I would text later. But the whole exchange felt distracted. Both of us were still thinking about the road behind us. I watched him walk toward his building, then pulled away. At that point, I was alone in the car. The sky was still light. The sun had lowered more, and the long shadows from trees and apartment buildings were beginning to stretch over the road. It was not dark enough to hide anything, but the late afternoon light had started to change the color of everything. I drove out of the apartment area and came to a red light. The car stopped. For a moment, I sat there looking ahead. Then I thought about the thing I had hit. I still felt guilty. What if it had been a dog? What if the animal had been injured and crawled away somewhere? What if I had missed it during the search? I wanted to check one more time. So I glanced down the road toward the direction where the small thing had run before I felt the impact. And that was when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person. There was a large shape moving slowly near the tree line farther down the road. It was far enough away that I had to focus, but close enough that I could see its body clearly. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was not standing upright in the clean, normal way a person would stand. It was hunched forward, moving with a heavy, uneven limp. Its limbs seemed too long. Its back looked wrong, sloped and narrow in some places, but broad in others. For a second, I could not understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the head. It resembled a deer, or at least it had the shape of a deer's head. But it did not look like any deer I had ever seen. Its skin looked pitch black, not dark brown, not shadowed fur. Black, it looked sickly, almost hairless, as though the body had been stripped down to something raw and unnatural. The shape of its torso was too thin in some places and too large in others. I could not tell whether it was covered in patches of fur, skin, or something else entirely. And its antlers were wrong. They did not look like normal antlers. They looked like bare branches in winter, long, uneven, sharp-looking pieces spreading out from its head, like the black outline of a dead tree against the sky. The creature was limping toward the tree line. It moved slowly, dragging or favoring one side. The motion was not like a deer walking. It did not bound. It did not step lightly. It shambled. It looked injured. And that was what truly terrified me. It was limping. My mind immediately connected it to the thing I had hit, but that did not make any sense. What I had hit had been small. Small enough to run beneath my car, small enough that I had felt only one quick roll and crunch, small enough that there was no damage to the vehicle. This thing was enormous. If I had hit something that big with my car, I would have destroyed part of the front end. I would have felt a massive impact. The car would have been damaged. The creature would not have simply gone underneath the vehicle without leaving blood, fur, dents, or broken pieces behind. But as I sat at that red light staring at it, the creature looked injured in exactly the way something might look after being struck. It was limping away. It seemed unaware of me. Or maybe it knew I was there and did not care. I do not know which possibility was worse. I was staring so hard that I lost track of time. The red light changed. Cars behind me may have started moving. I do not remember hearing horns, but I know I sat there too long. It took me maybe 30 seconds to realize that the light had turned green, and I was still at a complete stop. My body finally reacted. I pulled forward. I drove through the intersection. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I kept looking in the mirror, though I knew I could not see much from that angle. Part of me wanted to get as far away as possible. Another part of me could not stand the thought of leaving without knowing what I had seen. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove almost a block away, then turned around. I needed to verify it. Maybe I had seen a person wearing some strange costume. Maybe I had seen a large deer standing in an awkward position near the trees. Maybe a trick of light had turned a normal animal into something terrifying for a few seconds. Maybe I had been shocked by the earlier impact, and my mind was now looking for an explanation. I did not know, but I had to look again. I drove back toward the intersection. My stomach tightened as I approached the area near the tree line. The creature was gone. There was nothing there. No huge animal, no person, no branch like antlers, no black shape limping into the trees. Just the usual line of trees and brush at the edge of the neighborhood. I slowed down. I looked as carefully as I could without blocking traffic. Nothing moved. I did not get out of the car that time. I did not want to. The sun was still out, but it was lower now. The trees cast thick shadows. There were too many places for something to stand just out of sight. I kept driving. The whole way home, I replayed it in my head. First, the small thing running in front of the car. Then, the distinct impact. Then the search. Then, the lack of evidence. Then, the enormous, limping creature by the trees. I kept trying to separate what I knew from what I assumed. What I knew was that something ran in front of my car. What I knew was that I felt a bump that seemed like I had hit an animal. What I knew was that my coworker and I looked for it and found nothing. What I knew was that the car showed no damage and no sign of an animal strike. What I believed I saw afterward was a massive deer-like figure limping toward the tree line. The problem was that all of those things together made no sense. I am not religious. I do not usually believe in paranormal explanations. I do not think every strange event is a ghost, a demon, a skinwalker, a monster, or whatever label people want to put on something they cannot identify. I am open to the possibility that my mind was playing tricks on me. Honestly, I almost need that to be true. Maybe I saw a small animal and misjudged the impact. Maybe it ran between the wheels instead of under them. That could explain why the car was not damaged. Maybe I felt the tires hit something nearby but not the animal itself. Maybe the thing I saw later was a sick or injured deer. California has deer in certain places. A deer with mange, disease, missing fur, or injuries can look deeply strange. A deer in late afternoon shadow can look blacker than it really is. Its antlers might have looked branch-like because they were partially hidden by the trees. Maybe it was a person. Maybe someone tall, wearing dark clothes, was moving through the trees with a bundle of branches or some kind of strange costume. Maybe the limp and body shape looked unnatural because the view was distant and the light was changing. Maybe I had been so unsettled by the impact that my brain connected unrelated things. That explanation makes sense too. I had just thought I hit someone's dog. I was already anxious. I was watching the exact area where the small shape had run. My mind may have been searching for something to explain what had happened, and when I saw a large shadow near the tree line, I turned it into something impossible. But I cannot stop thinking about the size. It was too tall, it looked too wrong, and it was limping. That was the detail that made the whole experience stick with me. It felt like it had been hurt. It felt as though the thing that had gone under my car had somehow become the thing I saw walking toward the trees. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I know it makes no logical sense. But that was the feeling I had. I did not see a normal deer. I saw something that resembled a deer in the same way a nightmare might resemble a familiar animal. It had the outline of one, but the details did not fit. Its body seemed too large. Its skin looked too dark. Its antlers looked like dead branches. Its movements were too slow and unnatural. It was like seeing an animal shaped wrong. Something familiar, but not familiar enough. Something that should have belonged in deep woods at night, not beside a suburban road in broad daylight. That was another thing that bothered me. Why was it there at all? This was not some remote forest road. This was a neighborhood. There were apartments, streets, traffic lights, cars, people, and sidewalks. It was still daylight. Someone else could have seen it. Someone could have driven past at any moment. But nobody seemed to react. No one stopped. No one pointed. No one got out of a car. For all I knew, no one else even noticed it. Maybe that was because it was not there. Maybe I was the only one who saw it, because my mind was already in a strange state after the impact. But my coworker did hear and feel the first part. He had been in the car. He got out with me. He searched the road and the brush. He saw that there was no blood, fur, or damage. So at least the beginning of the story was not only in my head. That has always been the part that makes me hesitate before dismissing all of it. I never told many people about it right away. It sounds too strange when you say it out loud. You can explain the impact easily enough. I thought I hit an animal, but we could not find it. That is believable. But then you add, later I saw a 7 or 8 foot tall black deer-like thing with branch antlers limping into the trees. And people either laugh, assume you are exaggerating, or immediately try to attach some paranormal explanation to it. I do not want either reaction. I do not need people to believe it was a monster. I do not need anyone to convince me it was definitely something supernatural. I only know that I saw something I could not identify, something that did not fit with the size of whatever ran under the car, something that made me stop at a green light because I could not look away, something that disappeared by the time I turned around and came back. Since then, I have tried to think about it more logically. Maybe the first thing was not an animal at all. Maybe it was debris in the road, something light enough to go under the car without damage but solid enough to create a bump. A plastic object, a piece of trash, a branch, something that rolled away or blew into the brush before we found it. Maybe the second thing was completely unrelated. Maybe it really was an injured deer near the tree line. If it had some kind of severe disease or injury, it could have looked almost hairless and black in the changing light. The antlers could have been normal, but appeared like branches from a distance. Those are explanations I can live with. They are not perfect, but they are possible. What I cannot explain is why the two events felt connected, why the small thing seemed to vanish, why there was no sign of any impact, why the huge creature looked injured, why it appeared exactly in the direction of the thing I had hit, and why, even with the sun still out, it looked so unlike anything I had ever seen. I have driven through that kind of neighborhood countless times since then. I have seen deer before. I have seen stray animals. I have seen injured animals on the roadside. I have seen shadows in trees and mistaken them for people until I looked again. None of those things ever felt like that moment. The memory is still sharp. The hazard lights blinking. My coworker and me searching the road. The empty pavement. The clean wheel well. The red light. The tree line. The tall black shape moving slowly away from the road. And those antlers spread behind its head like bare branches against the fading daylight. I do not know what I saw. Maybe it was a sick deer. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was two separate ordinary events that became tangled together because I was scared. Maybe my mind did exactly what minds sometimes do. It took a confusing moment and created a terrifying explanation from pieces of shadow, guilt, and uncertainty. But every time I think about it, I remember that limp. And I remember the sudden, impossible thought that whatever I had just driven over was now walking away from me on two legs, enormous and broken, heading into the trees. That is the part I have never been able to forget. My grandmother died slowly. It was not sudden. There was no single phone call that changed everything in one moment. No one terrible day that divided life cleanly into before and after. It happened over a couple of months, in small changes that were hard to notice at first and impossible to ignore later. At the beginning, she was still herself most of the time. She was weaker, of course. Everyone could see that. She got tired more easily. She moved more slowly. Her voice became softer. Some days, just sitting up seemed like a lot for her. But she could still talk, still recognize people, still hold conversations that sounded almost normal if you did not look too closely at how fragile she had become. There were good days and bad days. On the better days, she would seem almost present again. She would remember things, comment on something happening in the room, ask questions, or make a small joke. Those were the days that gave everyone hope, even when we knew hope was becoming something different from what it used to be. At first, hope meant recovery. Later, hope meant comfort. Hope meant that she would not be in pain. Hope meant that she would not be afraid. Hope meant that she would have one more good hour, one more clear conversation, one more moment where she looked at us and knew exactly who we were. That was how the last months went. Everything became measured in moments. A meal she managed to eat, a name she remembered, a hand she squeezed, a sentence that made sense, a smile that looked like the one we knew. One of those moments was when she got to meet my daughter for the first time. That memory has stayed with me in a very different way from the stranger things that happened later. It was sad, obviously. There was sadness wrapped around everything by then. But it was also beautiful. My daughter was still very young. I remember bringing her in and feeling unsure of what my grandmother would be like that day. By that point, there was always uncertainty. You never knew whether she would be awake, whether she would be tired, whether she would recognize anyone, whether the room would feel peaceful or tense. But when she saw my daughter, something changed. There was a moment of lucidity in her face. It was subtle at first. Her eyes focused. Her expression softened. She looked at the baby, then looked at me, and I could tell that she understood what she was seeing. She knew. She knew this was my daughter. She knew this was someone new in the family. She knew she was looking at a child she loved before she had even had the chance to know her. For a little while, she seemed completely present. She spoke clearly, maybe not as strongly as she once had, but clearly enough that there was no doubt about her meaning. She looked at my daughter with a kind of tenderness that I still cannot fully describe. It was not just happiness. It was happiness mixed with exhaustion, grief, love, and something that felt like goodbye even though nobody wanted to say that word. I remember thinking how strange it was that life could hold two things at once. A new person had just entered our family, and someone who had been part of that family for so long was slowly leaving it. My grandmother held that moment with my daughter in a way that made it feel important. I do not know whether she knew it would be the only time they would ever meet, but I think some part of her did. She looked at the baby as if she was trying to remember every detail. The small hands, the face, the sound she made, the simple fact that she was there. For all the confusion and weakness that came later, that moment was clear. It was real. It was one of those memories that hurts, because it is beautiful. But not every clear moment she had was like that. There were other times when she seemed lucid, or almost lucid, but the conversations were different. They were harder to understand. At first, I thought she was just confused. People nearing the end of life can say things that do not make sense to the people around them. They can mix up time, places, names, and memories. They can speak as if someone from decades ago is still in the room. They can ask for people who are not there. They can become convinced they need to go somewhere, get ready for something, or finish some task that nobody else understands. I had heard that happened. I had seen small signs of it before. But with my grandmother, it was not always vague or scattered. Sometimes she would speak with incredible clarity. That was what made it unsettling. There were moments when she seemed to be having a full conversation with her brother, not remembering him casually, not saying his name in passing, not telling a story about when they were young. She spoke to him as if he were standing somewhere in the room, as if he were close enough to hear her, as if he had come to see her. At first, it was easy to miss. She might look toward an empty corner or toward the side of the room where nobody was sitting. She would become quiet, then say something softly. Maybe she would pause as if listening. Maybe she would nod. If you were not paying attention, you could think she was talking to herself. But then the conversation would continue. She would respond to things nobody else had said. She would ask questions. She would sound emotional in a way that did not resemble ordinary confusion. She would talk about pain. She would talk about how hard it was. She would talk about leaving. And she would ask him if he could help her. That was the part that got to me. She did not sound lost in the way someone with a fever might sound lost. She did not sound like she was simply repeating old memories. She sounded as though she was speaking with someone she trusted completely. Someone who knew her. Someone she loved deeply. Someone she believed would understand what she was going through. Her brother had meant a great deal to her. He was not just another relative she happened to mention once in a while. He had been important to her in a way that came through whenever people spoke about their family history. She loved him intensely. She had looked up to him. In her mind, he had been a kind of hero. So when she seemed to speak to him, it was not like listening to a random hallucination. It felt personal. It felt private. And somehow, that made it more frightening. There is something deeply uncomfortable about being in a quiet room with someone you love, watching them look past you and speak to a person who is not physically there. Not because you think they are crazy, not because you want to laugh or dismiss it, but because the conversation feels too intimate for you to interrupt. You are there, but you are not part of it. You become a witness to something you cannot understand. I remember sitting in the room during one of those moments. The lights were low. The room had that stillness that seems to gather around someone who is very ill. There were small sounds in the background, the quiet hum of equipment, the rustle of blankets, the soft movement of someone shifting in a chair. But otherwise, it was silent. My grandmother was lying there, and for a while she had seemed tired. Her eyes were half closed. I thought she might be asleep. Then she opened them, not suddenly, slowly, and she looked toward a space beside the bed. Her expression changed. At first, she looked almost relieved. Then she began speaking. Her voice was weak, but the words were clear. She spoke to her brother as though he had just walked in. She said things about how painful it was. She talked about being tired. She talked about how hard it was to leave. The word leave stayed with me. Not leave the room, not leave the house. Leave in the larger sense. She seemed to understand that something was happening to her, something that could not be stopped. She seemed to know she was moving toward the end of something, and she was speaking to him as if he could explain what came next. She asked if he could help her. I remember how quiet everyone in the room became. No one wanted to speak over her. No one wanted to say there is nobody there. No one wanted to interrupt something that seemed so serious. We just sat there, listening. I do not know what she thought he was saying back to her. She would pause after she spoke. Sometimes she would listen. Sometimes she would nod slightly. Sometimes she would seem to respond to a question or reassurance that none of us could hear. It was one of the strangest feelings I have ever had. On one hand, I understood that her mind might have been creating something comforting. That is the explanation I still come back to when I try to understand it. Maybe her brain was doing what brains do when someone is under enormous physical stress. Maybe old memories, love, fear, pain, and the need for safety were all coming together. Maybe she was constructing the presence of someone who had mattered to her deeply because that was the person she most needed in that moment. Someone who loved her, someone she trusted, someone she believed would help her. There is something almost beautiful about that explanation. It would mean that even as her body was failing, some part of her mind reached for the person who made her feel safe, but there was another part of me that could not shake the feeling that something else was happening. Not necessarily something evil, not necessarily a ghost story in the usual sense. It was not like the room suddenly became cold, or objects moved, or anyone saw a figure standing in the corner. It was quieter than that. More personal. More difficult to talk about. It felt like she was speaking with someone who had arrived for her. That thought terrified me, and it also comforted me. Both feelings existed at the same time. I was scared because I could not explain it. I was comforted because she did not seem alone. That is the part I still struggle with. When you see someone you love dying slowly, there are moments when you want them to stay, no matter how much they are suffering. You want to keep them in the room. You want one more conversation. You want them to recognize you again. You want them to open their eyes and become themselves the way they were before. But there is also a point where you can see the cost of asking them to stay. You can see how tired they are. You can see how much pain they are in. You can see that their body is no longer cooperating with them. And then, hearing her speak to her brother about how hard it was to leave, I felt something I did not expect. I felt guilty for wanting her to stay. Because if she really believed he was there, if she really believed someone she loved was waiting for her, then maybe she was not as alone or afraid as I had imagined. Maybe she was being helped in some way I could not see. Or maybe her mind was giving her exactly what she needed. I do not know. I do not think I ever will. There were several moments like that over the course of those months. They did not happen constantly. There were days when she was simply tired, days when she slept, days when she was confused about ordinary things, days when she seemed to drift in and out of awareness without speaking much. Then there would be a moment when she seemed startlingly present, but not in the normal way. She would look beyond the people in the room. She would speak to her brother. She would ask about what was next. She would speak as though a difficult journey had already begun, and she was waiting for guidance. Sometimes the conversation sounded calm. Other times it sounded painful. She would say that she did not know if she could do it. She would talk about being scared. She would ask him to help. And every time, the room would change. Not physically. Nothing dramatic happened. But the atmosphere changed. Everyone would become quieter. The people who had been talking softly would stop. Someone might look toward the same empty space she was looking at. Someone might wipe their eyes. Someone might hold her hand more tightly. No one wanted to say what they were thinking, but I think everyone felt it. We were witnessing someone standing at the edge of something we could not follow. I remember one time feeling genuinely afraid, not because she said anything violent or disturbing. She did not. It was because she sounded so certain. She was not rambling. She was not muttering disconnected phrases. She was having a conversation. There was a beginning, a middle, and an emotional logic to it. She would say something. Then she would pause. Then she would respond. Her tone changed as though someone had answered her. It was hard to sit there and tell myself it was only neurons firing in unusual patterns. Again, I am not saying that is not what it was. It may have been exactly that. The brain is powerful. Memory is powerful. Love is powerful. A person in pain may reach inward toward the people they have loved most deeply, and the experience can feel as real as any conversation in the room. But from the outside, it was eerie. The experience was not theatrical. It was not exaggerated. That is what made it feel so strange. There was no music, no wind, no dramatic change in the room. Only my grandmother talking softly to someone she seemed to see, while the rest of us sat nearby, listening to a conversation we could not join. Sometimes, after one of those moments ended, she would seem exhausted. Her eyes would close, her breathing would change. She might fall asleep or drift away from us again, and the room would return to normal. Someone would speak quietly. Someone would adjust her blanket. Someone would ask if she needed anything. We would look at each other, but not know what to say. It felt wrong to call it a hallucination in that moment, not because I was sure it was something else, but because the word felt too cold. It did not capture what had happened. A hallucination sounds random. It sounds meaningless. It sounds like noise. But what she experienced did not feel meaningless. It felt like a conversation built out of love, fear, memory, and the need not to be alone. Maybe that is all it was. Maybe that is enough. I think about the fact that she had moments of true lucidity too. She knew my daughter. She looked at her and understood. She spoke clearly. She held on to that moment. That made the other conversations more difficult to categorize. She was not simply gone all the time. She was not completely disconnected from reality. She moved between states. One moment, she could recognize a new member of the family and respond with love. Another moment, she could speak to someone who was not in the room and ask them about leaving. It was like she had one foot in two different worlds. I do not mean that literally. At least, I do not know if I mean it literally. But that is how it felt. She was still with us, but she was also somewhere else in her mind, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. That uncertainty is what made it spooky. If it had been only confusion, it might have been easier. If she had been talking nonsense, it might have been easier. If she had been frightened and calling out random names, it might have been easier. But she spoke to her brother with tenderness. She spoke as though he was close. She spoke about pain and leaving with a clarity that made everyone else in the room feel like intruders. Years later, I still remember the way it felt to be there. I remember the quiet. I remember the dim room. I remember the way she looked toward a space near the bed. I remember the pauses after she spoke, as if she were listening. I remember wondering whether I should look where she was looking. I remember not wanting to. There are some questions that feel dangerous to ask, not because they will hurt you, but because you are not sure you want an answer. Was there someone there? Was she seeing someone real? Was she seeing the person she most needed to see? Was her mind trying to comfort her? Was she already beginning to say goodbye in a way we could not understand? I do not know. I do not think anyone in the room knew, but I do know that it changed how I think about dying. Before that, death had been something abstract. something that happened in stories or far away from daily life. Even when you know older relatives will eventually die, some part of you thinks it will always be later. Then you sit in a room and watch someone you love slowly fade. You watch them struggle to remain present. You watch them recognize a new child in the family. You watch them speak to people who are no longer physically there. You hear them ask for help with whatever comes next. And suddenly, death feels less like one moment and more like a border, a long, uneven border. Sometimes the person is still on your side of it. Sometimes they seem to be looking across. I still do not know whether what my grandmother experienced was physical, spiritual, psychological, or some mixture of things I do not have words for. Maybe her neurons were firing in a way that created an intense and comforting hallucination of someone she loved. Maybe her brain reached into the strongest memories she had and gave her a companion when she needed one most. Maybe she was simply dreaming while awake. Maybe grief and fear made the people around her interpret her words in a more mysterious way than they really were. All of that is possible. But I also know that when it happened, it did not feel like a dream. It felt like being in the room while someone you loved spoke to someone just beyond your reach. It felt like hearing a goodbye that was not meant for you. And it felt legitimately spooky, not because it was evil or threatening, but because it was too intimate and too unknown to explain. I think that is why the memory has stayed with me, not because I need to decide what happened, not because I need to prove there was something supernatural, but because I will never forget the sound of my grandmother's voice when she spoke about leaving. I will never forget the way she asked her brother if he could help her. And I will never forget sitting in that room, surrounded by people who loved her, while she seemed to be speaking with someone none of us could see. It was frightening. It was sad. And somehow, it was also one of the most human things I have ever witnessed. My brother went with me on this trip. I do not remember every practical detail of why we were there now, but I remember the house clearly. It was one of those places that looked less like a normal home and more like a mansion someone had turned into a place people could visit. It had a long driveway, large rooms, high ceilings, and the kind of old, polished interior that made you lower your voice without being told to. From the outside, it was impressive. From the moment we walked in, it was even more so. The entryway opened into a large downstairs space with dark wood, old furniture, framed art, and decorations placed carefully enough that it felt more like a private collection than an ordinary house. There was a fireplace in the main room, and above the mantel were items that immediately drew my attention. There was a Native American statue near the fireplace. It was tall enough that you noticed it right away when you came into the room. The figure had what looked like an authentic headdress, with feathers arranged around the head, and there was a bow and arrows displayed above the mantel. I did not know the history of the objects. I did not know whether they were genuine, decorative, inherited, collected, or simply things the owners had bought because they liked the look of them. But they did not feel like casual decorations. The whole downstairs had Native American art and works placed around it. There were paintings, carvings, small sculptures, woven items, and framed pieces on the walls. My brother and I spent the first part of our time there walking through the downstairs rooms and looking at everything. We were not trying to be disrespectful. We were honestly impressed. The house had the kind of atmosphere where every room seemed to have something worth looking at. One wall might have a painting. Another might have shelves with older objects. In another room, there would be furniture that looked too expensive to sit on. The place felt quiet, but not empty. There are houses that feel empty when nobody is speaking. This one did not. It felt like it held onto sound. The floors creaked in a low, old way. Air moved through vents and halls with a faint rushing sound. A door shutting in another room could echo farther than you expected. Still, at first, nothing about it seemed frightening. It was simply old, beautiful, strange, and full of objects that had obviously been chosen by people who cared about the way their house looked. At some point, my brother had an unlit cigar with him. I do not remember whether he had brought it for later or had picked it up before we arrived. I only remember that he took it out while we were in the kitchen and placed it on the counter. The kitchen was large, with wide counters, cabinets that looked older but well cared for, and windows facing out toward the back of the property. It had a different feeling from the rest of the downstairs. The front rooms were more formal, filled with art and things meant to be looked at. The kitchen felt more practical, though it was still much nicer than most kitchens I had been in. My brother put the cigar down near the edge of the counter. I remember seeing it there. It was unlit, just sitting on the counter where he had set it. Then we went outside. The back of the house opened toward the grounds, and the property stretched farther than either of us expected. There were open areas, trees, landscaping, and the kind of space that made the house seem even larger once you stepped outside. We walked around for a while. We looked at the yard, the edges of the property, and whatever else there was to see. It was calm outside. I remember the air feeling different from inside the house. Outside, everything felt open and ordinary. There were sounds of wind, birds, distant traffic, or nothing at all, depending on how far from town the house was. It was easy to forget the strange quietness of the inside when we were out there. Eventually, we came back in. My brother went into the kitchen and looked for his cigar. It was gone. At first, he thought he had misplaced it. He looked around the counter. He checked near the sink. He looked in the area where he had been standing before we went outside. Nothing. He asked me if I had moved it. I told him I had not. We looked around the kitchen for a few minutes, but it was not there. Then we found it in the den. It was sitting on a table in a completely different room. The den was not directly connected to the kitchen in a way that made it easy to confuse the two. You had to leave the kitchen, go through part of the downstairs, and enter the den. It was not far, but it was far enough that neither of us should have casually set the cigar there without remembering it. My brother picked it up and looked at me. I remember him saying something along the lines of, "Did you put this here?" I told him no. He insisted he had left it in the kitchen. For a second I felt uneasy, not terrified, not enough to think something impossible had happened. But it was strange. The cigar had been on the kitchen counter. We had both been there. We had both seen it. Then we went outside together. Neither of us had picked it up. Neither of us had gone into the den before finding it there. Still, I tried to explain it away. I told myself my brother had probably forgotten where he placed it. That is an easy thing to do, especially when you are in an unfamiliar house with a lot to look at. Maybe he picked it up without thinking while we were walking around and set it on the table. Maybe he had brought it into the den before going outside and just did not remember. That seemed more likely than anything else. He was not fully convinced, but we did not make a big deal out of it. We just moved on. As the evening came, the house changed. The daylight faded from the windows. The large rooms that had felt impressive in the afternoon began to feel more isolated. The old wood seemed darker. The quiet became more noticeable. I was staying in an upstairs bedroom near the garage. The room itself was comfortable. It was not creepy in any obvious way. It had a bed, furniture, a window, and whatever normal things you would expect in a guest room. But it was separated enough from the rest of the upstairs that I was more aware of being alone there. The hallway outside my room led toward other parts of the house, and the garage was below or nearby. I could hear occasional small sounds through the walls. At first, I assumed it was the house settling. Old buildings make noise at night. Wood expands and contracts, pipes shift, air moves through vents. A house that feels silent in the daytime can become full of tiny sounds once the rest of the world quiets down. But then I started hearing footsteps. They were not loud. They were not running. They did not sound angry. They sounded like someone walking slowly down the hallway. A step, then another, then a pause, then another step. The first time I heard them, I thought it might be my brother. Maybe he was going to the bathroom. Maybe he was walking around downstairs. Maybe he had gotten up for something. I listened for a voice or a door opening, but I did not hear either. The footsteps stopped. A few minutes passed. Then I heard them again. The sound seemed to come from outside my room, near the part of the hall that led toward the garage. I could hear the floorboards react under weight, but nobody knocked. Nobody spoke. Nobody opened my door. I lay there listening. There are certain sounds that do not seem frightening until you are alone at night in an unfamiliar house. Footsteps are one of them. During the day, they are ordinary. At night, when you know almost everyone is asleep, they make you wonder who is walking and why. I thought about getting up and checking. I did not. Not because I was terrified, but because I did not want to make the situation bigger than it was. I told myself it was an old house. It was likely settling. Maybe I was hearing pipes or someone moving in another room. But the footsteps did not sound like pipes. They had a rhythm. They sounded deliberate. Still, they did not feel malicious. That is the part that is hard to explain. I did not feel threatened. I did not feel like something was trying to get into my room. I did not get the sense that I needed to run or hide. The feeling was more like someone was present somewhere in the house, moving through it quietly. I lay there for a while, thinking about the art and objects downstairs. I thought about the statue near the fireplace. I thought about the headdress, the bow and arrows, the old-looking works displayed throughout the home. I thought about how strange it felt to see so many cultural objects collected and placed around a huge old house. At some point, a thought came into my mind. I wondered whether the house might have been built on land that had once been important to native people, or perhaps near somewhere people had been buried long before the house existed. I did not know that for a fact. I had no evidence for it. It was only a thought that came to me in the dark while I listened to footsteps outside my room. But once I thought it, I could not stop. I began thinking about how much had been taken from Native Americans over the years. Land, homes, family history, belongings, burial places, language, and dignity. I thought about how people could build over places that had mattered deeply to others and never know or never care. Lying there, I felt a sudden wave of sadness. Not fear exactly, more like shame on behalf of people who had lived long before any of us and had been treated terribly. In my mind, I apologized. I did not say it out loud at first. I just thought it. I thought how awful it was that people could take land, destroy sacred places, and then build houses on top of them. I thought that if there was anything connected to the land or the past of that place, I was sorry for what had happened. I was not trying to perform a ritual. I was not trying to communicate with anything. I was just lying there in the dark, thinking about the house, the collection downstairs, and the history that might exist beneath places we take for granted. I silently apologized for what people had done. Then the footsteps stopped. Not dramatically. They simply stopped. The hall became quiet again. I remember lying there for a few minutes afterward, waiting to see whether I would hear them return. But they did not. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, my brother left to go to Walmart for cigarettes. The house was quiet again after he went out. I decided to take a shower and get ready for the day. By then, the strange feeling from the night before had faded a little. In daylight, it was easier to tell myself it had all been normal. Maybe the footsteps had been my brother. Maybe the house had made ordinary sounds. Maybe I had been thinking too much because I was staying in an unfamiliar room near the garage. After I showered, I went back to my bedroom. I remember opening the door and stopping. There was a red-tailed hawk feather sitting upright on my pillow. It was not lying flat. It was not tucked into the blanket. It was standing upright, as though someone had placed it carefully there. For a few seconds I did not move. I just stared at it. The feather was large enough that it was impossible to miss. It had the colors and markings that made it stand out as something unusual, not just a random little feather that had blown in through an open window. I had no idea where it came from. The windows in the room had been closed, at least as far as I knew. I had not brought it in. My brother had already left for Walmart. Nobody else had been in my room while I showered, as far as I knew. I thought about whether it could have been caught on my clothes. Maybe it had stuck to a towel somehow. Maybe it had been on the floor and I had not noticed it. Maybe the air from the room or a vent had moved it into a strange position. But none of those explanations felt right. It was upright. Placed. That was the word that came to mind. Placed. I did not feel afraid. That surprised me. After hearing footsteps the night before, after the strange cigar situation, after thinking about the history of the land and apologizing in my mind, I might have expected to feel frightened by finding something like that on my pillow. But I did not. The feather did not feel threatening. It did not feel like a warning. It did not feel like I was being told to leave. It felt quiet, almost gentle. I stood there for a while, looking at it. Then I said, "Thank you." I do not know who I was thanking. Maybe nobody. Maybe I was thanking the universe for a strange coincidence. Maybe I was thanking whatever part of the house had made me feel less alone the night before. Maybe I was simply responding to something that felt personal, even though I knew it could have an ordinary explanation. But I said it. Then I left the feather where it was. I did not throw it away. I did not pick it up and carry it around. I did not make a big scene about it. I just left it on the pillow. For the rest of the trip, I kept thinking about the order of events, the cigar moving from the kitchen to the den, the footsteps outside my upstairs bedroom, the thoughts I had while lying awake in the dark, the quiet apology I made in my head, then the red-tailed hawk feather standing upright on my pillow the next morning. Each part by itself could have had a normal explanation. My brother could have forgotten where he left the cigar. The house could have made noises that sounded like footsteps. The feather could have come in somehow without me realizing it. It could have been carried in on a jacket, stuck to a shoe, blown through a gap, or left behind by someone else. But together they made the house feel different, not haunted in the way people usually mean it, not evil, not dangerous. It felt like the house had a presence, or maybe the land around it did. Something quiet, something that did not want to scare us, but did not want to be ignored either. I do not claim that was the truth. I cannot know. I do not know what happened in that house before we arrived. I do not know who owned the objects on display, where they came from, or whether the home had any connection at all to native history beyond the art and decorations placed inside it. I do not know whether the thought about a burial site came from something real or from my own imagination after spending an evening looking at Native American pieces in an old house. But I do know how it felt. It felt like I had entered a place with a story I did not understand. A place where old things were displayed beautifully, but perhaps without anyone fully knowing what they meant or where they belonged. A place where footsteps moved through the upstairs hallway at night without making me feel threatened. A place where a feather appeared on my pillow after I had quietly apologized for things I had never personally done, but still felt sad about. The house did not feel malicious. That is what has stayed with me most. Even the strange events did not carry the feeling of danger. The footsteps did not rush toward me. The feather did not make me panic. The cigar moving was odd, but it did not seem like it was meant to frighten us. Everything felt more like a reminder, or maybe just coincidence arranged in a way that made me pay attention. I still think about that house sometimes. I think about the large fireplace and the statue standing near it. I think about the objects spread across the downstairs rooms. I think about the way the mansion-like space became quiet after dark. I think about lying in the upstairs bedroom near the garage, listening to footsteps move slowly through a hallway I could not see. And I think about opening my bedroom door the next morning and finding that feather standing upright on my pillow. I do not know where it came from. I do not know whether someone placed it there. I do not know whether it was a strange accident, an overlooked detail, or something that felt meaningful only because of the night before. But I remember looking at it and feeling no fear, only gratitude. So I said thank you, and I left it there. Tonight's stories are over, but darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully, and do not trust every shadow that stays still.